On the morning of April 7, 1945, American dive bomber and torpedo pilots flying off carriers north of Okinawa received orders to locate and destroy a target, unlike anything most of them had ever been sent against. The battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed warship any navy had ever built, sailing directly toward the American invasion fleet, with barely enough fuel to make the journey one way, and no meaningful air cover to protect her at all. What followed was roughly 2 hours of sustained aerial attack that ended with the largest battleship in naval history capsizing and exploding in a blast so massive it was seen and felt for miles around, taking nearly the entire crew down with her. This is the story of what happened to the pilots who sank Japan's last great battleship, and the sailors aboard Yamato, who were sent on a mission their own commanders privately understood had almost no chance of accomplishing anything beyond a symbolic, final gesture of resistance. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. Why would Japan's naval command send its most powerful remaining warship on a mission with no air cover and only enough fuel to get there, against an enemy fleet everyone involved in the planning already understood could not realistically be defeated? Construction of Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, already lost the previous October during the Battle of Leyte Gulf while escorting Kurita's force through the battle off Samar engagement, covered elsewhere on this channel, had consumed an extraordinary share of Japan's pre-war and early wartime industrial capacity, resources that, in retrospect, some historians studying Japanese wartime industrial allocation have argued might have produced considerably greater strategic value if directed instead toward naval aviation or submarine construction, a debate that reflects the broader tension between Japan's traditional battleship-centered naval doctrine and the carrier-based warfare that would actually decide the Pacific War's outcome. Japan's decision to invest so heavily in a single class of battleship, even as it became increasingly clear during the early years of the war that carrier aviation was emerging as the decisive naval weapon, reflected a broader institutional and doctrinal inertia within the Imperial Japanese Navy's senior leadership, many of whom had built their entire careers and strategic worldview around the traditional battleship-centered naval doctrine that had defined major navies worldwide for decades before the war. A doctrinal commitment that proved genuinely difficult for institutional culture to abandon, even as accumulating combat evidence increasingly demonstrated its obsolescence. The Yamato represented the absolute pinnacle of battleship design and construction, a vessel displacing over 70,000 tons at full load, and armed with 18.1-inch main guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on any warship in history, weapons capable of firing shells weighing well over a ton to distances beyond 25 miles. She had been built in near-total secrecy before the war, specifically to give Japan a qualitative advantage in the kind of decisive battleship engagement Japanese naval doctrine had long assumed would eventually determine control of the Pacific, a doctrine built around the same traditional big-gun naval thinking that had shaped Japanese strategic planning since the era of Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima decades earlier. By April of 1945, however, the entire strategic assumption underlying Yamato's design and construction had already been overtaken by events. The Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Philippine Sea had already demonstrated conclusively that carrier-based naval aviation, not battleship gunnery, now decided the outcome of major fleet engagements, a shift in the fundamental character of naval warfare that left a vessel as magnificently over-engineered as Yamato facing a genuine and uncomfortable question about what meaningful role, if any, remained for her in the war's final and most desperate months. Yamato's own combat record through most of the war had been, by the standards of her enormous cost and construction priority, strikingly limited, the battleship having spent much of the conflict's first 3 years in reserve or rear area deployment rather than direct combat. a pattern that reflected Japanese Naval Command's persistent reluctance to risk such a valuable and symbolically important vessel in circumstances where her survival could not be reasonably assured, a caution that stood in notable contrast to the mission she would ultimately be sent on in April of 1945. With American forces having landed on Okinawa in early April and threatening what Japanese military leadership understood to be one of the last major defensive positions before any eventual invasion of the home islands themselves, Japanese Naval Command authorized Operation Tengo, a mission that would send Yamato, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and a screening force of destroyers, toward Okinawa, with orders to attack the American invasion fleet directly, and, if the ship survived long enough to reach the island, to beach herself and continue fighting as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. The mission's planners understood, even as they issued these orders, that Japan's naval air power had been so thoroughly depleted by this stage of the war that no meaningful fighter cover could be provided for the task force during its approach, leaving Yamato and her escorts to face American carrier aircraft with essentially no aerial protection of their own. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, the officer given command of the task force for this specific mission, reportedly expressed his own private reservations about the operation's tactical wisdom to colleagues before departure, reservations that, according to several post-war accounts, reflected a professional naval officer's clear-eyed recognition of exactly what the mission's outcome was likely to be, even as he prepared to carry out the orders issued to him by senior naval command, a position echoing the same institutional loyalty and professional duty this channel has examined in the context of other senior Japanese officers ordered to execute operations they privately understood carried little realistic chance of success. Yamato was loaded with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa, a detail that has become, in the decades since, one of the most frequently cited and symbolically weighted facts of the entire mission, whether interpreted literally, as evidence the ship was never expected to return, or understood more broadly, as reflecting the mission's fundamentally desperate and largely symbolic character. Senior Japanese naval officers involved in planning the operation reportedly understood privately that Tengo carried virtually no realistic prospect of meaningfully disrupting the American invasion of Okinawa, but proceeded with the mission anyway, driven by a conviction, expressed by at least some of the officers involved, that the Imperial Japanese Navy could not simply remain in port while the army fought and died defending Okinawa, whatever the practical military cost of sending Yamato out to die alongside them. The specific rationale senior Japanese naval planners offered for authorizing Tengo, reconstructed by historians through post-war interviews and surviving documentation, centered on a conviction that the Imperial Japanese Navy needed to demonstrate some tangible commitment to Okinawa's defense, specifically because Japanese army forces on the island were already engaged in the brutal ground fighting this channel has covered in earlier episodes. And naval leadership reportedly felt that allowing the fleet's most powerful remaining warship to sit idle in port while soldiers died defending the same island would represent an unacceptable failure of inter-service solidarity, whatever the operation's actual tactical prospects. Stop and consider what this decision actually meant for the roughly 2,700 to 3,000 sailors aboard Yamato as she got underway. Because unlike the individual volunteer commitment involved in the kamikaze aircraft missions this channel has covered previously, every man aboard Yamato was committed to this mission as part of the ship's entire crew complement, with no individual choice about whether to participate in what senior planners already understood to be an operation with almost no realistic chance of tactical success. The specific route Yamato's task force took toward Okinawa was chosen to avoid the most heavily patrolled American search areas, but the sheer size of the battleship and her escorts, combined with the extensive American reconnaissance network operating throughout the region, by this stage of the Okinawa campaign, made effective concealment of a force this large essentially impossible once it had departed Japanese home waters. A detection reality Japanese mission planners had almost certainly anticipated, even as they proceeded with the operation regardless. American reconnaissance aircraft and submarines detected Yamato's task force shortly after it got underway, providing Task Force 58's carrier commanders with advance warning that allowed them to organize a massive, coordinated strike specifically to intercept and destroy the battleship before she could ever come close to reaching the American invasion fleet at Okinawa. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58's carrier forces, and whose earlier tactical decisions this channel has examined in the context of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, oversaw the coordination of this massive strike effort, organizing successive waves of aircraft from multiple carrier groups to ensure sustained pressure against Yamato's task force, rather than a single concentrated attack that might have allowed Japanese anti-aircraft gunners a period of respite to reorganize their defenses between American passes. The American strike force that launched against Yamato on the morning of April 7th numbered well over 200 aircraft, dive bombers and torpedo bombers drawn from multiple carriers, a concentration of air power specifically assembled to guarantee the destruction of a single, if extraordinarily powerful enemy warship, a scale of aerial commitment that itself reflected just how seriously American commanders continued to regard Yamato's raw firepower, even in a war whose fundamental character had already shifted decisively away from battleship gunnery toward carrier aviation. Yahagi and the escorting destroyers faced their own desperate fight during this same sustained attack. Smaller and less heavily armored vessels that, despite their more limited size, still carried genuine anti-aircraft firepower and maneuvered aggressively to draw American attention away from Yamato where possible. A tactical pattern that, while ultimately unable to prevent the eventual destruction of most of the task force, reflected genuine coordinated effort among the escort commanders to protect the flagship for as long as tactically possible, given the overwhelming scale of the American attack. For the American pilots flying against Yamato that morning, the mission presented a target unlike anything most of them had encountered previously in the Pacific War. A ship whose sheer scale and volume of anti-aircraft fire made the attack runs genuinely dangerous, despite the total absence of Japanese fighter cover to contest the sky above her. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers pressed their attacks in coordinated waves over roughly 2 hours, torpedo planes specifically targeting Yamato's hull below the waterline in an effort to open the flooding that would eventually prove decisive, while dive bombers worked to destroy her anti-aircraft batteries and superstructure, a sustained, methodical assault that Yamato's own gunners fought desperately to counter, despite having no realistic prospect of driving off an attack of this scale and coordination. Mitsuru Yoshida, a young communications officer who survived Yamato's sinking and later wrote one of the most detailed and widely read first-hand accounts of the ship's final voyage, described the mounting sense of inevitability that settled over the crew as successive waves of American aircraft continued their attacks with almost mechanical persistence, a psychological experience distinct from the more chaotic, briefer combat many Pacific War veterans described, since Yamato's crew endured roughly 2 hours of sustained, escalating damage, with full awareness of exactly how the engagement was likely to end. Surviving Japanese accounts from Yamato's crew, gathered from the relatively small number of sailors who survived the ship's eventual sinking, described the attack's final hours as an experience of accumulating, inescapable damage, torpedo hits progressively flooding the ship's hull despite counter-flooding efforts by damage control crews working to keep the increasingly unstable vessel upright, until the cumulative flooding finally overcame the ship's stability entirely. Yamato capsized and, in her final moments, suffered a catastrophic magazine explosion so massive that American pilots still overhead described a mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke and debris rising thousands of feet into the air. An explosion powerful enough to be observed and felt from a considerable distance by ships and aircraft throughout the surrounding area. Damage control efforts aboard Yamato in the attack's final phase involved increasingly desperate counter-flooding measures, deliberately admitting seawater into undamaged compartments on the ship's opposite side in an effort to offset the progressive listing caused by torpedo damage concentrated primarily on the port side of the hull, a standard emergency technique that, under normal circumstances, might have preserved the ship's stability, but that ultimately proved insufficient against the sheer volume and concentration of torpedo hits the sustained American attack continued to inflict over the engagement's full duration. Of the roughly 2,700 to 3,000 sailors aboard Yamato when the attack began, only approximately 280 survived the ship's sinking, a casualty rate reflecting both the ship's rapid capsizing, which trapped large numbers of crew below decks with little opportunity to escape, and the catastrophic magazine explosion that killed many of those who might otherwise have had a chance to abandon ship successfully. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers escorting Yamato were also sunk during the same sustained attack, a near-total destruction of the entire task force that reduced what remained of Japan's operational surface battle fleet to a fraction of what had sailed out from Japanese waters just hours earlier. Rescue operations for Yamato's survivors, conducted by her own surviving escort destroyers in the chaotic aftermath of the sinking, faced their own significant challenges, given that the same American aircraft that had just destroyed the battleship remained present in the area and continued to pose a threat to any rescue vessels attempting to recover survivors from the water. A dangerous rescue environment that meant a number of men who had survived the initial sinking still faced considerable additional risk before reaching the relative safety of a surviving Japanese vessel. American losses during the entire engagement were remarkably light by comparison. A small number of aircraft lost to Yamato's anti-aircraft fire against a task force that had, in the space of a single sustained attack, effectively eliminated the last significant Japanese surface combatant fleet capable of contesting American naval control anywhere in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Yoshida's post-war memoir, published in Japan in the years following the war and eventually translated for international readers, played a significant role in shaping how both Japanese and Western audiences came to understand Yamato's final voyage, presenting the mission not as a straightforward heroic last stand, but as a more psychologically complex experience combining genuine courage among the crew with an underlying awareness, shared by many aboard, that they had been sent on a mission whose actual military value their own senior officers privately doubted, a candid perspective that added significant nuance to how the operation was subsequently understood by historians studying the war's final months. For the American pilots who participated in the attack, the scale of destruction they had just witnessed, and the corresponding scale of Japanese loss of life aboard a single ship, left a complicated impression that several participants described in later interviews and memoirs, a mixture of professional satisfaction at having executed a difficult and dangerous mission successfully, alongside a more somber recognition of just how many men had died in those 2 hours aboard a vessel whose sheer size and apparent invulnerability had made the scale of the eventual destruction genuinely difficult to process, even for combat veterans who had already witnessed considerable loss of life across years of Pacific fighting. These reflections, gathered by historians and journalists interviewing surviving American pilots in the decades following the war, contribute to a broader and recurring theme found throughout first-hand accounts of the Pacific War's final year. Veterans on both sides increasingly describing not straightforward triumph or defeat, but a more complicated recognition of the sheer scale of destruction the war's final campaigns had reached. a scale that individual participants, regardless of which side of a given engagement they had fought on, frequently found difficult to fully reconcile with their own personal experience of the specific missions and battles they had actually lived through. Several pilots specifically noted, in post-war accounts, a kind of awe at Yamato's scale even as they participated in her destruction, a recognition of the sheer engineering achievement the ship represented, even while confirming, through the mission's outcome, exactly how obsolete that kind of engineering achievement had become against the specific combination of carrier aviation and coordinated strike planning American naval doctrine had developed by this stage of the war. Operation Tengo's outcome, understood in the context of the broader strategic trajectory of the Pacific War's final months, confirmed with brutal finality a shift in naval warfare that Midway and the Philippine Sea had already signaled years earlier. That the era of the battleship as the decisive instrument of naval power had definitively ended, replaced by carrier aviation's ability to locate, target, and destroy even the most powerfully armed and armored surface combatant, without that vessel ever having a realistic opportunity to bring its own guns to bear against the aircraft actually determining its fate. The specific location and condition of Yamato's wreck, resting at a depth of over 1,000 feet on the seafloor, made detailed survey work extremely challenging even with the improved deep-water exploration technology available by the time serious investigation efforts finally began, decades after the war. And the wreck's dramatic state, broken into two major sections, with debris scattered across a wide area of the seafloor, provided physical confirmation of just how catastrophic the ship's final magazine explosion had actually been. A level of structural destruction consistent with the scale of blast American pilots overhead had described witnessing in the moment itself. Yamato's wreck, broken into sections on the seafloor southwest of Kyushu, was not located and surveyed in detail until decades after the war, a discovery that provided historians and naval architects with direct physical confirmation of exactly how catastrophic the ship's final magazine explosion had actually been, the wreckage pattern itself serving as a kind of physical historical record of the battle's final, decisive minutes. The broader symbolic weight Operation Tengo carries in post-war Japanese historical memory extends well beyond its narrow tactical outcome. Frequently cited and discussed as one of the starkest illustrations of the increasingly symbolic and sacrificial character Japanese military planning had taken on by the war's final year. A mission whose planners understood before it even began that its primary value would be demonstrative rather than tactical. A final, costly gesture from a navy whose senior leadership had concluded, even as they issued the orders sending thousands of men to their deaths, that some display of continued resistance mattered more than the men's actual survival or any realistic prospect of altering the war's ultimate outcome. Remember the question this story opened with: why send Japan's most powerful remaining warship on a mission with no air cover and only enough fuel to arrive, against a fleet everyone involved already understood could not realistically be defeated? The honest answer, established through decades of subsequent historical research and the direct testimony of officers who planned and survived the operation, is that Tengo was never really conceived as a mission that could win. It was conceived as a mission that had to be attempted, regardless of the odds, because the alternative, a navy that simply remained in port while soldiers died defending Okinawa, had become, in the minds of the officers who authorized it, a worse outcome than sending thousands of men to their deaths in a battle everyone privately understood was already lost before it began. If you want to understand how the largest battleship ever built was sent on a mission its own commanders privately understood could not succeed, and what happened to both the American pilots who destroyed her and the sailors who went down with her, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater. told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.